Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I am so glad you're here. It's so nice that we're having events where we can actually be in a room together and share an experience. So thank you for helping us to break that ground. This is actually our first event in this room. We started to use it for a few meetings, but you are trying it out for the first time for an event. So I hope you enjoy it, and definitely if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it. So I said all that, and I didn't introduce myself. My name is Charmaine Williams. I'm the dean here at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this evening. Very excited to have Dr. Mullings here, and to have this as our event, one of our events of Social Work Week, which is also Black Mental Health Week in Toronto, which is also Social Work Week Month, which let's all celebrate those of us that care about it, International Women's Day, many reasons to be happy this week. Before we get started, I'm going to do the land acknowledgement. So I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which those of us are here first are gathered is where the University of Toronto operates, Treaty 13 territory. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn, teach, and work on this land. I appreciate that we have these land acknowledgements at the beginning of all of our events, and I know that for some people it's starting to feel a bit perfunctory that we just read these things, but I always think it's an opportunity to, first of all, remember and renew our commitments to what the treaties have put in place for us. We are all treaty people on this land. And to think about how the event that we're doing is going to honor the values and worldviews of the people that have been here for so long. You're not supposed to read something like that and then decolonize your exclusion. So today, I think it's great. I think it's wonderful that we're having a talk that's about Africentric social work. I think in the same way that Indigenous people have taken strong steps forward to claim sovereignty over their services and over their communities, I think Black people need to do that as well. I think we have a lot to draw on to do that. And I think that those of us that are Black social workers and those of us that are not Black social workers also have roles to play in this important work. So I'm so glad that we're going to discuss that today. So before we get started, I want to remind you, you can see this is a hybrid event. And for those of you who are in the room with us, I discovered something really interesting about this room recently. It has wonderful microphones so that you can hear all over the room what's going on. And you know what I'm going to say next, right? So it turns out that the microphones are either kind of all on or all off. So while Dr. Mullings is up here speaking, if somebody in the back row decides they would like to share their recipe for salsa fresca with the person beside, the people at home will get that recipe just as clearly as they hear what Dr. Mullings is saying. So this is a moment for you to consider maybe share that recipe later. And also, if you've got phones or anything that's making noise, it's a great moment to check on that. The second thing is that this lecture is being recorded so that others may share it, so that others can view it after. Another reason to watch what you're saying out there. And the camera is focused at the front of the room, so you won't be on camera. But like I said, they'll be able to hear you quite clearly. For the Q&A, we have options with the phone so people can see what's going on. And for those of you that are coming in online, we also have things set up so that we'll be able to receive questions from you and be able to bring them into the discussion too. Lastly, for those joining us on Zoom, live captioning has been enabled, and you can turn this on at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so now in terms of the event format, we are going to be giving a talk that will run until about 7 o'clock, and from 7 o'clock to 7:30, we're going to have Q&A discussion about what we've heard. But as I just said, those of us who are joining us online will be able to submit their questions through the chat or through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we actually don't have the chat working. I'd like to remind everyone, both in person and online, that we are looking forward to a fruitful, stimulating, respectful dialogue here. And so we're going to do our best to get to all the questions. I know from experience that it's not always possible to get to all the questions, but we will do our best to do that. And if we're not able to get to you, I'll apologize in advance for that. So now I will turn to the speaker introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Delores V. Mullings. Dr. Mullings is a full professor and former Interim Associate Dean Undergraduate Programs at Memorial University School of Social Work. She's also Memorial University's inaugural Vice-Provost, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Anti-Racism, the first Black person and Black woman to hold a permanent senior administrative position at that university. She brings with her over 40 years of resistance work in organizational change, climate scam, strategic planning, as well as anti-racist and decolonizing efforts. Her interdisciplinary scholarship explores decolonizing post-secondary education, mothering, mental health and wellness, LGBTQ plus concerns, the Black church, elders, supplemental integration, and community engagement using critical pedagogies, in particular anti-Black racism, Africentric theory, and critical race theory. That's quite a list. Dr. Mullings' current research includes promoting Black students' mental health, a pan-Canadian research and intervention project on social determinants of health and equity in Canadian universities, improving COVID-19 vaccine confidence and uptake among Black Canadians, Black youth mental health after COVID-19, and community inclusion in small urban centers. One thing that's not in this bio that I assume will come up during the talk is also that Dr. Mullings has recently published a book with a group of colleagues on Africentric social work practice, which I think is incredibly exciting. And I imagine that we will hear some of the thoughts that went into that in our talk today, and I'm really looking forward to that. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. Delores Mullings.
Evening, good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Dr. Charmaine Williams, Professor Dr. Charmaine Williams, for the invitation to come and share time with you and ideas. And I'd really want to also thank your team for just making my experience in coming here from start to finish really seamless and stress-free. So I want to thank you for that. And in particular, Dijo, Quayson, and Dale Duncan, who's over there, they were simply amazing. So I'd like to do a later acknowledgement. I want to honor the memories. Successes, and contributions of Black African ancestors whose blood colored the waters of the Middle Passage and whose flesh and bones are cradled by Mother Earth. I honor the work that our Black and African ancestors accomplished and which has allowed myself and others to continue the activism of racial justice and the eradication of anti-Black racism. We are in a better place today because of them. Also want to thank those of you who are here in this space for coming to share or listen to some ideas, and also thank those of you that are online. I want to turn around and say those of you that are online. So today we're going to three very simple ideas we're going to take up: African Canadian and Black Canadian around social work history and liberation, Africentric social work, what is it, how does it work, and the importance of having people of African descent that are going to provide leadership for how this work is done. So I'm going to first locate myself, just let you know how I'm situated and why this work is important to me. So I identify as a Black woman of African ancestry who was born and raised in Jamaica. As a child, I roamed beautiful land, bathed in waters, salt and fresh water, ate fruits. I was a climber too, by the way. Ate fruits from the trees. It was just fabulous. And, that would set the foundation for my adult life. I've been privileged to live in places where I can walk to water. So I love water. I like playing in it, watching it, as I was looking at it. And of course, you understand that the playing and jumping in parts, that would be somewhere warm. And you're looking at and taking it more cold. Okay. As a child, I grew up, for those of us who grew up in rural areas in particular, I was raised by a number of women, and two aunties, a granny. I'll just say granny instead of grandma, because that's what we said, a granny, and some other women that really impacted my life in a very, very specific way. And, that's one of the reasons why I'm standing here today, the benefits of those women. And then, when everything was all great, our parents who had immigrated to Canada decided that they were going to take us over to Canada, much to our chagrin. And then, we packed our bags and we came reluctantly and found out that this place that was called Canada looked nothing like the nice pictures we saw. Those pictures that you used to get from about Niagara Falls, and people used to have their beautiful summer clothes on, and shining on their faces, and everybody was smiling. No. So we thought, no, this is not the Canada that we saw. They must have brought us somewhere else, or they were sending us pictures of somewhere. So fast forward, I have two amazing living children. I call them my Black queen. And a mother who now resides in a nursing home, who continues to be the single most important teacher in my life. Single most important teacher in my life. And I have, a complicated history with social work loosely. I have some experience in hospitals and shelters and sexual assault centers. I think I'd say that's where I got my grounding work in and my motivation to do this kind of work. And believe it or not, I did a stint in a major bank computer operations, so secret, right? That wasn't for me, so I left. I went back to school as a mature adult and did the necessary jumping and night not sleeping and those things to get myself into position in one of the people in front of the room, helping to transform social work education. And so in 2009, I went to Memorial University, and that was my big start. And that's basically a little bit of a something about who I am, so you get a feel of where I'm coming from, childhood. I'm going to tell you a story about mathematics. I'm going to link it at the end as well. Who likes mathematics? People online. Yes or no, or something? So I'll tell you, I didn't know I didn't like mathematics till I was 3. That was pretty early. I know you're going like, what, 3? So in Jamaica, we have what we used to call basic schools. And I remember I was somewhere between 3 and 4. And I went to basic school, and I so remember the teacher trying to teach us, little one, about division. And at that time, they were using bundles of sticks, right? Bundles of sticks to teach us. I couldn't get it for the life of me. Couldn't get it. And I think that's when I decided I didn't like math, because I couldn't get it. Okay? Then I came to Canada, so you'll see there's stages. I came to Canada, grade 9. Math teacher, Mr. Mihalik, was known to be one of the best teachers. And I could see how he was, because I could see that some people were really excited about it. Me, I ended up with something like 26 or 24% in math. And it wasn't, so I'm going to say, I don't think it was because he didn't like me because I was Black. I just want to be clear, because there were other students in the class that did exceptionally well, and he loved them. And they were also Black, so it was sort of like maybe a frustration that I didn't like math. And then in grade 10, 11, Mrs. Grooms, the only teacher, black teacher I would have in math. All of a sudden, I like that. All of a sudden. And in fact, in grade 11 and 10, I had Mrs. Grooms, and at the end of one of the semester, I looked at my mark. And so now I got like in the 70s, and that was big for me. Because remember, 26%, right? Went to summer school and scraped through. And I was like, how I got this low mark, right? So Mrs. Grooms did something for me about math that I don't know what it is. So hold on to that story until the end. So here now I'm going to sort of talk about a little bit of a history and what it looks like for Black social workers in Canada. The social work history and liberation. Social work, like all other professions or disciplines, has some blemishes, right? Nothing's perfect. And so in social work, we tend to romanticize our beginning, how we started, and but firewall 2016 suggests that social work history has been whitewashed. And Shepard and Pritzker 2021 also reminds us that African American social work activists contribute greatly to reforming of the discipline. We also suggest that social work was born out of human rights, a human rights agenda, and that early social work embodied the kind of human rights principles and practices that should make us all proud to be connected to such a noble profession. That is the story that is cultivated. And it's really half the story, right? It's half the fact, because a lot of that sort of is a bit distorted and some people are left out. So Leanne Francis argues that white social workers did not want to work with Black people specifically, but they work with all other groups of people, also indigenous and racialized. Francis notes that white social workers believe that everybody could be saved from their social conditions, such as poverty, and then they used to say alcoholism, anger, poor work habits, and so on and so forth. But Black people were unsavable. She knows that while many Blacks in the US were poverty-stricken, white social workers refused to support them, but we know that a similar situation happened here in Canada. In addition, although social workers in Canada would primarily within child welfare, within children and family welfare agencies, they did not want to work with Black children. The Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children opened its door in 1921 for Black children because most orphanages in Canada did not take in Black children. So James R. Johnson, a lawyer and activist, helped to bring this home to life. And Black communities were happy somewhat to have this service and felt that in some cases their children had a safer place to go to when families were in a bit of a crisis and just needed support. And so social workers and police officers would drop children off at the orphanage without letting the children know that they would, in some cases, never see their families anymore, and told them that they were just going for a ride somewhere or for a visit. And so the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children was a private orphanage that later turned into a group home, and during its tenure there was no government oversight or accountability measures put in place for these Black children who later shared their experiences of racism, violence, neglect, and abuse, which occurred over a 15-year period. That's not simple. From these experiences, many people who are now, So many people who are not necessarily called social workers at that time, many of them are now gone, really did a lot of work to support many of the children and families that were not supported, largest before. the larger social work profession. And one such, a group of such people would and some of the people who would support the children and other groups of people, Black people coming, would be the Association of Black Social Workers, which was formed in the 1980s.
Dr. Mullings, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're just getting some questions online that they're having trouble hearing. We're wondering if you don't mind. Sorry.
So I don't want this to be all doom and gloom. I started giving you a lot of the, the more negative parts of it. We don't want to be toxic positivity either by saying, oh, nothing was wrong and wow, we went through it and so on and so forth. So I want to acknowledge that there were some things that just were not okay and we've moved forward. So, I want to honor Vaccine-Provost Shepherd, Francis Wells Clements, Peter Tolliver, and Senator Dr. Thomas Bernard, because you might know, and if you don't know, go look up the Association of Black Social Workers in Nova Scotia. These four women were considered the association, and Dr. Thomas and some of these women talked about how they were, when everybody was calling upon them, we need to speak with the ABSW. It was four people, and it was like, yes, we are the association, and they were raising children, doing a lot of work in the community, all kinds of things. And for the longest while, they were probably the second association of Black social workers. Now there's a second one out in Edmonton. But I want to give a nod to, and these are professional social workers, but I'll talk about I think people are seen as not professional, but they're doing the work we're doing. So this is the book that Dr. Williams was speaking about. So myself, Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard, Dr. Jennifer Clark, Dr. David S., and Dr. Suma Diwa edited this first of its kind book that speaks to Africentric social work. Let me just go on and say, following the tradition of African collective living, historically, Black families, groups, and communities supported each other regardless of where they lived and their circumstances. So Black Canadian social work scholars, Thomas Bernard, Brown Spencer, and S. helps us to understand the importance of the Black church and Black women's roles in developing social clubs, mutual aids, and other voluntary organizations to support Black individuals and families within Black communities. The social supports were financed by members of the Black communities until the 1970s, when the federal government implemented the Federal Multiculturalism Act, and then people could apply for money, and they were able to pay, people professionally to do certain kinds of work with these small pots of money. But Black communities sustained themselves in absence of support from the larger social work community, who thought really again that Blacks in Canada were unworthy. As the profession grew and formal training was recognized as the first social work program right here at U of T in 1914, and then McGill in 1918, Black people became interested in the social work profession and started doing professional social work programs and becoming social workers in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. However, these Black social work pioneers faced anti-Black racism in employment. They were unable to find work as social workers in social welfare agencies, and so initially some of them worked in post office as orderlies and nurses' aides. When they were hired, white social workers racially harassed them. White children and parents refused to accept service from them, and many were bottlenecked in entry-level positions, never able to advance into their careers. We have a chapter in this book, the the social work pioneers, and some of this came out in the research that Dr. Christopher Walmsley, Senator Wanda Thomas, and David X. You don't have your book. It's time. So Black People's history and contributions to social work profession has been silenced and erased. This is, for the most part, so this is demonstrated in this particular text that really chronicles 100 years of English-speaking social work in Canada and excludes the experiences and contributions of Black social workers, pioneers, or any kind of mention. This is just a little bit of social work Black history, and building on its history, you can see that aside from the advocacy of Black social work scholars, students and practitioners, the markers of progress have moved very little in contemporary Canada. That's a little bit of an issue. But don't worry, I'm coming back to some positive things. But there is a growing scholarship in social work scholarship. And I'll just list, a couple. So, Clark, Pato, and McKenna in social work that is filling the gap by highlighting African Canadians' contribution. There seems to be also a growing interest in social work, social work disciplines through practice or education to have or highlight the experiences of African Canadians. And we see this in two texts earlier on, Hicks and Stokes in 2017, and Eves, Love, and Smith in 2006. In spite of these latest inclusions, we know very little about early or what we call Black African Canadian professionally educated social work pioneers. And so I give you a little bit of an introduction of what that might look like. So I'll speak a little bit about the 16 people, again, that's in this book, social workers. Some of them are not listed because they were still afraid of potential backlash if they talk about their experiences. So although they're pioneers and we really want for them to, their names to be out there, their them or their families to know, but we do have some that's public, and I'll talk about some of those. And it's a really small number. 15 is a small number. But my granny used to say, them little but them talawa. That just means that if they're small, but mighty. And they made significant collective contributions to every area of social work, including social services, general community life, and Canadian politics. And as professional social workers, really somebody said the sky is the start. As opposed to living, and they did everything, because if you remember, there was a time where nobody would work with, our people. And so they did child welfare, they did, after school programs, they did prison work, they did, spiritual, they did everything, right? Therapeutic work, settlement houses, all those kinds of things, right? So I'm just going to talk to you about some of the people that are public. Just a little tiny bit. So, and these are just public officials. So, Francis Clemens, was Annapolis County School Board, was a member of the Annapolis County School Board and town councillor. John Braithwaite was a municipal politician in North Vancouver. Rosemary Brown, the first African Canadian woman to hold elected office in Canada, and all these are social workers, by the way, professionally educated social workers. Elected in BC legislature in 1972 to 88, she ran for the federal New Democratic Party leadership and actually gave Ed Broadbent a run for his money. And from 1993 to 96, she was the chief commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. In 1972, Emery Barnes was the first African Canadian man elected to the BC legislature, and in 1994 became elected speaker. 1981 to 86, Calvin Rock was appointed to Nova Scotia's Human Rights Commission, and in 1988 was called to the Senate of Canada after a very distinguished career. So we know that the pioneers experienced a lot of anti-Black racism, misogyny, anti-immigrant sentiments, and they continued the journey. So people like myself know we are indeed resting on their back, and we have no choice but to build and move the legacy forward. One pioneer said it best: there is too much to be done. I don't have time to be angry. And I'm not just toxic, positivity, or, that nothing is wrong, but we must keep the vision alive. And so that's part of what we're here to talk about tonight. One way we're doing that in social work is by carving out a unique space to address the needs of African Canadians in social work practice. And I would say, as Dr. Williams, is that, we are taking the lead from Indigenous Canada's Indigenous social workers who have very clearly and made the argument that there needs to be a different way of working with and for Indigenous people. And so we are feeling blessed that somebody actually has laid some tracks down so that we don't have to start from scratch. And so here we go. So I just want to make one more note about this. So if you look at the dates on these two books, and I know I put the Africentric book early, even though it's later, but that's how it goes, right? But 2011 and 2021, exactly 10 years after this book was published that erased us, we have a book that really recenters our experience from all over perspectives. Isn't that amazing? And the articles in this book, they're like bone chilling. There's no plot. But, I'm just one of the editors. Okay, so what is Africentric? Oops, I wasn't following my own. Okay, so what is Africentric social work practice? So Africentricity is a pillar used around the world as a foundation to center, honor, and protect African ancestral knowledge systems, practices, and ways of being. As you know, social work is a new discipline, and so we borrow from everybody. And rightfully so, we're borrowing Africentricity. And so principles such as Sankofa, meaning that we bring all our relations with us as we move forward, and that we must know and understand our path in order to know where we're going and to not repeat lessons that we've learned, and also to impact our future as we strive to do things differently. So an Afrocentric framework prepares and enables social workers to practice with Africans and peoples in the manner that they deem necessary and that is racially, culturally relevant. And Brent Goodley notes that the framework utilizes African philosophies, histories, and culture as a starting place of interpreting social and psychological phenomena, create relevant approaches of personal, family, community healing, and social change. So it's all about Blackness, understanding it, understanding where people are at, what they need, and what's happening. And why Africentric practice? Because the question has been, why can't we apply anti-oppression? And why can't we apply anti-racism? And those are fabulous questions. Those are very valid questions. So here is one perspective of why we need an Africentric perspective. So I've already briefly discussed some of the colonial legacy of the Eurocentric social work practice. And what we know, and there's a growing critique about anti-oppressive practice and how it recenters hierarchies of privilege. And the person who is actually applying the theory or the framework is actually the person in power. So the power is not distributed and it's not changed. An anti-racist practice cannot sufficiently attend to the historical trauma and violence of the transatlantic. Exploitation Project, which continues to impact peoples of African descent today. So every group of people everywhere, somewhere, experience enslavement. We know that. Not chattel enslavement, the way that people of African descent were enslaved. And Dr. Joy Blue has helped us to unpack how the brutality of enslavement shows up as post-traumatic slave syndrome for a generation. So our work needs to actually take those pieces into account. The United Nations declared in 2015 to 2024 would be the international decade for people of African descent. And they said to strengthen actions and measures to ensure the full realization of the economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights of African descent and their full and equal participation in society. When the United Nations Working Group came to Canada in 2017, they also implored the federal government, by Prime Minister Trudeau, to implement a system to ensure that people of African descent in this country were deemed or categorized as a unique group of people. And they also suggested that because Canada had slavery, right, enslaved African peoples, that when any policy is going to be developed and implemented, that those experiences must be consideration. To address anti-Black racism, which really, is the root cause of some of the things that we see in our society today, with employment, those kinds of things. So anti-Black racism, we know, and Lon Wen said, intentionally or not, has caused harm to people of African descent, and that includes Canada. However wonderful this country is. Remember what I said, nobody's perfect? So the minutes are... So what I want to say now, and just sort of like leading into what does an Africentric perspective look like, is there are lots and lots of people of African descent who are in social work. We have a lot of students, we have educators, we have researchers, we have practitioners, right? So we can no longer say everybody in social work are racist, or ever, like it's a colonial system. If we continue to say that, it means nothing has changed, and that's not true. That's not true. We know that. Look at this room, right? So we know that. And sometimes it's really easy to say, oh, the colonial system, and the anti-Black racism, and it is true. And I also think it's important for us to see the gains that we've made, because if we continue to say all those other things, we will never see the gains, and all the gains that the people before us made so that we can be in this room would be erased. And we really don't want to be erasing anybody or any of the work that people have done, including the work that people might have done yesterday or this morning. So just to think about that just a little bit. So there are 6 principles. So within this book I just showed you, the Africentric Cooking of Passion, we built on what Senator Wanda Bernard Thomas and Dr. David S. had for these principles. We basically built on them. Jennifer Clark and myself expanded these principles to make them a little bit more robust. And know that, again, this is not new, but now it's written, and it was written before, because the ABSW, the Association of Black Social Workers in Nova Scotia, they've always been using these principles. if you see the kind of work that they've done with government officials and child welfare agents, they've been using these principles. So these are not me. What I'm saying is we don't want to take credit because the book is published to say that we did it. We're built basically in what they've done. So when this book came about because the Association of Black Social Workers in Nova Scotia have had a conference. And from that conference, Senator Bernard and Dr. S were going to take papers from the conference, ask people to write, and then put this book together. But of course, I was always following Senator Bernard, with Dr. Bernard then, we need to write a book, we need to write a book, we need to write a book forever. And when I contacted her one of those times, she said, you know what, we're actually thinking about this and would you like to be a part of it? Like, oh yes. But the reason for the book is because we wanted to have something written comprehensively that we can say, these are some of the things to consider when you're thinking about the Black experience in social work and where we want to go with it. And we also think it's important for us to do our own work. We need to write, we need to acknowledge that people have done the work, we need to provide leadership, we need to put the tracks down for what this is going to look like. So that's sort of like in a nutshell why we felt. We also felt, some of the gaps I talked about, that we needed to address some of those gaps. So here we go. So principle one, that you see individual problems holistically and rooted in the holistically and rooted in the family, community, and social structures. And before I do that, I just want to say the vision for social work practice really is racial, cultural shifts to disrupt, white supremacist ways of being. Also, the patriarchal ways of being, colonial perspective in how people of African descent are dealt with in social work. So all the bodies that are sitting here and some that are not is a part of that process that we expect, we know, will help to move this agenda forward. So the theoretical interpretation of principle one really is to challenge. The challenges are seen as structural in nature rather than individual. So rather than pathologizing people, we see that they have challenges because of what's happening around them physically and structurally. And so maybe what I also need to say is we're going to talk just very briefly about, these principles, but this is not the time to sort of like have a full-blown workshop or seminar about what it is. And we also, this interpretation also seeks to alleviate identified problems, systemic changes that are necessary. And of course, interpersonal relationships are important too in this regard. Principle two is to raise individual and collective consciousness. So here's how I can explain this. As whenever we hear that somebody has been shot or hurt publicly, that's what. Really doesn't matter where you are in the world. You're feeling it. So that kind of collective consciousness, not only when it's negative, but when it's positive too. When one of the big world events, that happened is when President Obama was elected. Even people here in Canada celebrated. Sort of wow, there's a Black president now. So that's the understanding around the collective. It's a sense of collectivity, regardless of the region, location, whatever country or whatever language we're speaking. So there needs to be an understanding that those pieces need to be linked together. Again, this is not to suggest that for every single person, we're talking about theoretically. Principle 3 recognizes the collective. Principle 3 recognizes the collective consciousness, and this is about recognizing, centering, celebrating, and honoring Black lives and the contributions and accomplishments, however they come, culturally, regionally, or graphically. This collective consciousness recognizes recognizing heterogeneity and rejects essentialization and narrowing and erasing the nuanced Black experience. Principle 4 critically analyzes the intersecting nature and lived reality of oppression. And that theoretically is interpreted by encompassing the intersectionality of social identities and factors such as race, gender, language, ethnicity, status, ability, sexual orientation, age, and so forth. And this acknowledges the compounding impact of multiple systemic and structural forms of oppression and how they intersect, create new forms of oppression in Black people's lives. And I know most of you might already know this, but how this shows up. One of the best examples theoretically is, Professor Crenshaw's article that, where the term intersectionality was coined, and she's talking about Black women, class, gender, race, and how that shows up. So that's just an example of what that might look like. Principle 5 is to help empower both individuals and collective and build on strength. And so a lot of times when we're working with an individual or family, we sort of like think individual. So child welfare, for example, in some provinces, they only work with the children, no longer with families. And so we really need to, and again, this isn't me, we really need to be working with everybody within the family. And recognize that people have inherent strength and resiliency. Again, not the kind of toxic resiliency where we say, well, these trauma happened and you just pretend like they didn't happen and you just keep moving on and expect that people are going to be okay. But just recognizing that trauma happened and, with proper support or, broad supports, holistic supports, people can be okay. And also build on what people have. Sometimes we try to introduce new things to people, so we really want to build on what people have rather than start to create new things. But sometimes things are politically sensitive too, or they're new and like, oh, let's try this thing. But what about what people have? It also assumes too that when you bring new things in, that people don't have any agency or they have little agency, and sort of like how we do education, is that we feed information rather than take what people have, this is what we have, and then work with that. And principle 6 is social change and social transformation. This is one of the critical pieces because a lot of times people really, as social workers, really want to help. That's why when you go into a social work class, BSW, first year, first class, why are you in social work? Why did you apply for it? What does everybody say?
To help people.
To help people. To help
We
people.
want to help
We
people.
want to help people, right? So when it comes to Africentric social work practice, people are going to want to help. And so what we need to consider is active participation in dismantling anti-Black racist, white supremacist, capitalistic, patriarchal systems and structures of domination. So it's more, this principle is more about what we do, dismantle systems, rather than what we do in working with individuals, families, and people. Because what happens is a lot of the times, people that we're working with are not able to access or impact those systems. And that's why we need to help people that open some of those doors so that they Feels long. Okay, so how do we do this? With leadership, with people of African, Caribbean, and Black leadership. So the theme for Black History and Liberation this year is telling ours to tell. And so with this particular, if we think about Africentric social work practice, it is ours to tell people how we want to see it formed, how we want to move forward, how we want to have it implemented in workspaces, educational spaces. So just like any other theory or practice modality, this needs to be taught in schools so that people begin to understand. And just because people have read a book or a couple of articles doesn't mean that they're actually ready to implement Africentric social work practice. Otherwise, it becomes, oh, I've read a book and we're going to check off something because now I can practice. It's really, really important. And if we've learned anything from indigenous social workers, is that actually does not work. And what it does is re-traumatize people and send them backwards rather than forward. So we need to be controlling what that looks like. And so the process of engaging with Africentric social work needs to be considered very clearly. We need to have people of African descent at every table, in every conversation, every public event that has to do with Africentric social work. We cannot have people doing it for us. So I want to give you an example. So when Mr. Floyd was publicly executed and everybody went out in the street, initially it looked like it was mostly Black people in a certain year. And then everybody right across the world just came out. And then what started happening as people were going out, the narrative got shifted from anti-Black racism to anti-racism and then multiculturalism. So this is an example of why it is important that Black people tell our own stories and we control this narrative, because otherwise people are going to shift it. If they're bad or, whatever, it's because people's agenda are not necessarily the same as their neighbor's agenda. And so it is important then that Black people control the narrative of what happened. So if you don't remember anything else that I said tonight, remember about the narrative shifting and how it is important that when we're not at the center, how we have no control about what happened. And so when we are going to work in partnership with, starting with, let's just say, racialized and indigenous social workers, because there are some similarities with experiences of racism, and you just don't really need to explain certain kinds of things. So there are steps to take. When we want to do this work, we take steps as we introduce this Africentric social work practice to different groups of people. What is important for us, I think, to remember is that white social workers make up the majority of social workers that are practicing, social work teachers, and so on and so forth. We cannot do this without everybody. We cannot. But we really need all hands on deck. I can't do anything with a boat, but I've heard that before, all hands on deck, and it sounds good right now. So we need all hands on deck with Black people at the helm of the boat. And that piece around transformation is where we will need people, social workers in positions of power who have access to policies to help to move this agenda forward. We don't have to fight about it. It is here, has been here for a while. We've been writing about it for a while. But we need to move it forward in a way that we can implement it so that Black people can benefit. So here are some of the change makers. And you know, there's another change maker right here in the building. Can you stand up for a second? Just stand up. Yes. Can you share what your name is?
Wilburn Hayes.
Wilburn Hayes. This is a change maker. Look at this. We've got a change maker right here. Building in front. So these are some of the change makers that are, you know, Dr. Akua Benjamin was one of the first, right? Or she laid some tracks down, didn't she? Mm-hmm. Right? And so, you know, there are different people that are doing different kinds of work. I pick these people as sort of like there are lots of more people than this, but I sort of have different kind of relationships with, I bother them a lot so they can avoid me. But, you know, I just wanted to put that out there too, that, you know, again, when we say all the negative pieces and that nothing has changed, what we're basically saying is what the pioneers did and what some of these people are doing or have done never happened in the first place. So back to that story. Remember that mathematics story? Okay. So the thing is, not every single person who is Black is ready or can actually do Africentric social work. We need to remember that. I'll explain to you why. So one of the easiest way for me to explain this is, so some people have been doing Africentric social work practice or asking for it and writing about anti-Black racism and for a long time. And it was like my grandmother would say they were like a penny dropping into a tin, like a pan, like just one penny happening. As the discourse changed and people started saying, oh, anti-Black racism, there were more people who never wrote about anti-Black racism sort of came out, Black people, and started writing about it. Why? Lots of reasons. People are now comfortable. They don't feel as much threatened. They're still threatened, but they don't feel as much threatened because all of a sudden it's on the national agenda. So they've been given permission. But it doesn't mean that they actually know anything about the nuance of anti-Black racism. Right? Because how many times have you heard Black people say, no, I've never heard that, I've never experienced anti-Black racism, right? So we need to be careful. And I say this now, I was speaking to somebody and they were talking about the N-word. And that person used the N-word with me. We were talking about scholarship. I would say it felt like 15 times, but it was only about 3 times. And every time that word was used, I felt like I was being stabbed somewhere. That person had no clue of the impact of that word, and that was a Black person, right? So all that to say is we need to be really careful when we say, oh, don't just pick somebody off the street because they're Black, assuming that they know, because we would never do that. That's why social work is fighting so hard to maintain its integrity. You know, why, you know, you can't just sociologists can't just be social workers, right? So, you know, even if you have a social work degree, it doesn't mean that you know how to do, I don't know, gestalt therapy or something, right? You still need to learn how to do that. So there is that piece. The other piece is Africentric social work practice is not universal. It does not work for every single person every single time. Not a magic anything. No magic wand, no, it's not like that. What we can do is we can develop the practice and keep developing the practice so that it actually works for a lot more people than it does now. The other thing is We're educated as social workers. What kind of education do we have? We know what that looks like, right? We know what the major theories are. We know major people that are in front of the classroom. We know how people are trained to be social workers. So we need to consider all those pieces when we begin to talk about Africentric social work. It's not, oh, look, we've got it now, right? We need to ask, listen, understand, take questions from the people who the community is saying as a leader. A lot of times what happens is some, I don't know, media outlet decides somebody who's floated to the top is going to be the spokesperson. And what you often hear people say is, who is that? And people are like, you don't know this person. They don't even ever come into the community. So again, we need to be mindful of who are we asking to develop this training, to help solidify this way of understanding how to work with African descent. And the last piece of, what happened to my math question? Where's the math thing? Oh, okay. So the thing I want to link with that math, remember how I said that my first experience as a kindergartner or basic school, and then Mrs. Groom, Mr. Mahalik, and then Mrs. Groom's, imagine how I still remember these. What happened then is that kindergarten teacher was using a colonial way of teaching me math. I only recognized that when I was trying to teach my own children math. And they're like, no, the teacher says this. And I'm like, I'm the parent in this house. I'm not sure what the teacher says, right? So, but Mrs. Grooms was somehow able to use whatever it is she had that spoke to me as, a Black teenager that encouraged me to love math. Again, they're both Black. And one of them was able to get through to me, and one of them was not. I don't, there's lots of things around circumstances. Who knows? Maybe, I didn't like my lunch when I was in basic school or whatever it was, right? But the thing is, something happened, and Mrs. Grooms pulled me out of that. And what I can tell you is this. I still struggle with formal math, but I can budget the pants off any finance minister in any country. So I know math. Right? Because I decided that I needed to learn it a different way, the way that worked for me. Okay? And there it is. There's the connection between this math story. Thank you so much.
Okay. I'm going to give you a chance to come and sit in a comfortable chair. Dr. Mullings, you've given us a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. I hope we're going to have a good conversation here. And while you sort of, give yourself take a breath there, I will just maybe briefly say that I really appreciated how you brought the history into this, because first of all, I don't think we do a great job teaching history of social work generally. I would say that even until recently, I mostly knew a history of social work that had to do with what happened in the US and a bit in the UK, but not so much about Canada. So to have somebody now talking about the history of Black social workers in Canada, I think is an important intervention in terms of us understanding who we are as social workers in Canada. And there's so many other histories that we need to include in a story about what social work Canada is, it has been, and how it's reflected in the things that we're grappling with right now. So thank you so much for doing that. And for calling out, faces and names that we know to sort of recognize their contributions along the way. So we're opening it up for questions. I am going to still, take the prerogative to be the first person to ask a question. And I'm trying to think which direction I want to go in. So I will start with one, and then maybe if there's time, I'll ask the other one too. So I think that, what you said about Indigenous social workers starting a project that now we can learn from, it's also true that, we are doing a project that others will learn from. Because there's no shortage of communities that are really looking for a way of doing social work that is not tied up with sort of what we used to call Eurocentric values and expectations. I was in a presentation about the history of social work where they were talking about its foundations in the work of the Daughters of the Empire, which tells you just about everything you need to know about what that was. So there are a lot of people, looking for that, and something that I see even in the people that are graduating from our program, which I am happy to say is a program that is increasingly diverse in terms of the student body, is that they are choosing not to even bother trying to transform the systems we have. They are creating their own things. They are creating their own things for the communities that they care about, whether that's Indigenous communities, Black communities, queer communities, neurodiverse communities. They're doing some, I think, pretty amazing things, actually. So what I want to ask you about that maybe will help others learn about is that, something that I think I know about social workers. I mean, you sort of pulled it out of the audience. We came into it because we wanted to help, right? We are people that want to help. We are people that are called by the need that we see. I think that these graduates are going out to respond to a need that they see. And in that, we are so committed and passionate about the work that we do. And I just wonder about, are we also talking about what we need for ourselves as Black social workers in this work where there's so much need, where we feel so much passion, where we have so many hopes and goals? How do we think about what in Africentric social work helps us understand what we also need for ourselves as the people that are doing it?
Good question. So I think you hit something there, because normally what happens is, as we've talked about, is when we think about doing social work, we're thinking about doing it for or to people. But what we do know is that people come in because they themselves have something to heal. There's a piece of them that needs healing, right? Which is why, again, if we actually don't do that healing, and I mean, it just doesn't start and stop, it's a continuum, but if we don't do that healing, sometimes we're not able to do our best work because we're still hurting. But I think without making it sound as if unrealistic, I really think that there needs to be a lot of relationship building, community building for Black social workers. And because some of the things that came out, these things we know already, but again, I'll point to the book, and some of the things that came out in the book is the trauma that people are feeling when they're trying to do Africentric social work or just trying to stay afloat. So I think lots of support, lots of connections with other people who are doing similar work or not. And I think the other thing too is sometimes we think we absolutely have no choice but to do this work. But the question is, do we not have other choices? And do we need to do the work the way we do it? Which tends to be the hardest, because every time you speak with people, they talk about how difficult it is. And are there different ways to actually do this work that are less labor on the body? And I'm talking about the whole body, mind, body, spirit, and the whole body. So I think what the social workers need is to sum up connections with other social workers. It doesn't matter what they look like, connections with other social workers, support for the work that they're doing. Sometimes it's tricky. People need to have other people around them to help lift them up. And also to consider, how do we do this work without actually destroying ourselves? Burnout rate is high. And even if you're in the classroom, it's still tough work. So how do we do this work? For sustainability, a little bit longer term and shorter term. So my primary thought.
So I'll look in the room and see if there's anybody who has a question in the room. Or I could check online.
We have some questions online. The first one is more of a comment, and I think it's related to another question of somebody who wanted to clarify something, so I'm going to combine them together. So the comment is, what you said about the shift from anti-Black racism to anti-racism is so true, and you see that playing out in the various programs being drawn up in Canadian cities, including Ottawa. I think this is kind of, so I wanted to throw that out there for comment from you, but I think this is related to a question that someone before had because they came around the same time. They said, I couldn't catch what example was given when something moved from Africentric to anti-racist to multicultural.
Okay, so it's related to the comments there, is that when Mr. Floyd was publicly executed, and we had lots of statements, anti-Black racism statements. So one of the things that happened is the people conflated anti-Black racism with anti-racism and anti-oppression and lots of other things. So they talked about Black people, but they talked about lots of different pieces. But the other thing was, so when other groups of people that were not Black went out into the streets to protest, it shifted from anti-Black racism to anti-racism and then to multiculturalism. So if you sort of like look at if you look at public discourse, you'll see the shift. And it was at least first a little jarring to see that now we're talking about what happened to anti-Black racism. And then the other thing is, it was brown, it was other racialized people, including brown people or different groups of people that was making the shift. And then the tensions were, well, why can't we talk about racism? Why do we have to talk about anti-Black racism? And so there's never a space. We never hold space for talking about only anti-Black racism. And so this is how Africentric social work is connected, because you actually need to talk about not just, but you actually need to talk about anti-Black racism. And so what I say then is, in all the social structures in Canada, in every single structure in Canada, Black people are significantly disadvantaged. One of the top two groups that's significantly disadvantaged, Indigenous peoples and Black people. And so that's why we need to attend specifically to anti-Black racism. And that's why it's not racism for everybody. And again, as I said earlier, it's the transatlantic enslavement piece and lots of those pieces that are built into it that we need to be concerned with.
Yeah, I think I would also sort of comment on that. I think that sometimes it starts from a place of allies joining in, right? Mm-hmm. So the allies are joining in and they're bringing what they know and their connections, and then it all starts to get a bit muddled. The original message gets diluted and muddled. I think the other thing is that we do, I think, have a discomfort about staying with one issue for a time, and saying, this conversation is going to be about this issue. And it doesn't mean we're not saying the other issues aren't important. We're not saying that there aren't intersectionalities in that. We all know there are intersectionalities in that. But we feel like there's this tension around, well, it doesn't feel quite right to only talk about, can I talk about this without talking about this other thing? And I think it's work that we need to do as social workers and in social work classrooms and all this. Like, how do we say that sometimes it's very important to just focus. We're going to go deep on this issue. We're going to put real energy into this issue. And at another point, we're going to put it into another issue, and I'm going to be your ally as you lead and talk about that issue. I think that's part of it
That's a good point. Yeah.
People in the room, I'm going to give you another chance. Anybody who has a question in the room? Thank you at the back there.
Hi, yes, thank you for the talk today and sharing your experiences and, doing that work to visualize. And I was just wondering, like, the title of this talk is erasing, and obviously you're talking about, visualizing anti-Black racism and the erasure of, historical figures in social work and whatnot. But how do you conceptualize erasure?
So if I bring you back to the slide around the 100 years of social work history in English Canada, where Black people were completely erased. And even work that's beginning to include Black people, it's about the work that we're doing now. It's not about the history and Black people's contribution to building social work. And so it kind of looked like it's only one group of people that's contributing to social work. And before, we had formal education, so formal social work schools, people were informally doing what shifted to formal social work. And so Black people were always doing that as well in parallel to white social workers, because for lots of reasons we talked about, right? Like we needed to do things for ourselves, and also nobody was practicing in our communities. So those pieces that talk of even the precursor to formalized social work, nobody talks about Black people. So we're completely erased. So how we're recentering that is having our own work be visible. So not only visible, but other scholars that are doing this work, and some of the pioneers that I spoke about, and also some of the people who they're not dead, but we can still call their names and honor them, and that's a part of making visible the contributions of Black people in social work.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. So thank you so much. By the way, I like what you're wearing. It makes me feel at home. I could really, so what you said about some Blacks not really, connecting with other Black people to say maybe they have been discriminated against, I can really, that resonates with me, because I migrated to Canada, and I came from Germany. I studied there, and throughout my years, I was never attacked. It was so good, But sometimes I feel like I'm in a closet when other people are, telling their experiences, how they are afraid to go on, that kind of thing. I'm even afraid to say, oh, really? I've never experienced. So they will look at you like, where have you been all these years? So that really, resonated. It doesn't mean that, I've been in maybe the right place at the right time, because sometimes you just find yourself in other places where, I'm a female, visible minority in a white man's land, so it's like, okay, are you safe here? But honestly, I felt safe everywhere I've been, and I don't know why, but it's not the same experience for everyone, and that's, for me, sometimes difficult to really contribute when people are really, you almost feel like whether they believe you or not, it doesn't matter, but it's my experience, And I just also wanted to quickly add to what you said about, anti-Black racism, just trying to separate that from, racism, etc. Because when people are rallying and they're saying Black Lives Matter, I have heard so many times where, why Black lives? Every life matter, that kind of thing, Why are you always saying Black lives, Are we not important, So for me, it's difficult, to really sort of defend yourself, to tell them why you believe that it has to be Black Lives Matter and not any because of the experiences that are happening. So it's not an easy thing, sometimes to say, but thank you. It's really eye-opening for me today.
So I have a lot of friends from the continent, and they say to me that, similar to what you're saying, is that their experience of racism is different. They talk about not having that experience, and that makes sense. And what we need to remember is anti-Black racism is structural and systemic. So even if you don't personally feel it, so somebody doesn't call you the N-word or so on and so forth, or tells you to go back home to your country or something like that, it's still operating. So what that means is somebody might see your application somewhere and decide, this person, no, we're not going to shortlist them. Or you go into the interview, or and they said, I can't understand what you're saying. And do people actually, I was just, sort of like doing some review of some things, and somebody was talking about having some experiences in hospitals where, the nurse thought that people who were educated in continental Africa did not know how to use a defibrillator or one of those things to save some life. She's a nurse. So that's how anti-Black racism shows up. It's not necessarily, it's systemic, right? Yeah, but I can appreciate that, because I have a lot of friends who said, I don't know what people are talking about when they say police run them down. And also, we do know that it doesn't matter where in the world you are, there's a police system. We just had 2020 and SARS in Nigeria, right? So, that's interactions with police. That has nothing to do necessarily with, a difference in race.
But I will never use the N-word for another Black person.
Right. You see?
How much I know.
Are we going to take one from?
Yes. So what do you think of the role of the white social worker as ally versus white savior? For example, in the movie Freedom Writers, Hilary Swank playing the role of a teacher, I believe in Compton, California, who changes the class and facilitates achievement for the students.
So that's not new. The white savior is always going to be there. And so what I would like to say to any movie, one of the first movies that I saw with a Black teacher, they were talking about Margaret Collins, I think. So with the white savior, she's always a nice white woman, right? And then the Black teacher is usually the worst thing in the world. Like, even if the Black teacher is having the same impact on the students, they show it in a particular way. So what I want to say is this around this white savior. We will always have it. Absolutely always. Do not give it as much attention as we do. Don't give it any attention. Don't watch the movie. I won't even have a comment. Outside of here, I will not have a comment about it, because that's just giving it life. And what we need to do, for me, is eradicate these kinds of discourse from around us. Because what it does is pits people against each other. It sets Black people up in a particular kind of way. Sets white people, a certain kind of white woman actually in a particular kind of way. It also sets the children up in a particular, and their parents, and it goes on and on, right? And so, yeah, I see it. That's how patriarchy works, right? And white supremacy. And, patriarchy works through white women too, right? We see it in politics.
Do you think maybe, Delores, that we all sort of need to check our savior impulses? Because I mean, I think that term ally, it's falling out of favor, I've noticed, right? We used to, I remember reading Becoming an Ally and really finding it quite inspiring, and now it feels like ally is a word you're not supposed to say too much. It's like we need to find some other way we need something else. So we all know we don't want to be saviors, right?
Yeah.
But it's partly like, I remember when I was doing my social work degree here, it was back when they had the business school here too. And so I had friends in the business school. Oh yeah, some we got some people who remember that.
Be nice to them, they're paying our taxes.
So I remember I had some friends in the business school, and I remember this person saying to me, "Oh, you're studying to be a social worker. You must be such a good person." I was like, "Yeah, I'm doing my best." But like, there is this like sort of notion of like it feels good to do good work, right? So I do sometimes think about, because I've done work with LGBT communities, and I'm not a member of those communities, right? I'm trying to do work, around inclusion here with the groups that aren't Black. I feel like I have to check my savior impulse. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what it looks like. Maybe I'm counting on somebody else to like pull me aside and say, "Hey, dial it back a bit here." I don't know. What do you think we're looking for there?
It feels to me as if you're taking directions, though. Mm-hmm. And what I know of you, I feel that you take directions. There is a difference with parachuting into a community and taking things over and making it look like everybody else did everything that was bad, and now all of a sudden this community can only survive and do well because of this one single person. It's very different than, right, you working in partnership and collaboration with people. And yes, ally has fallen out of favor, mostly again because people have shifted what the word originally meant in terms of working to break down systems and barriers and taking on some of the heavy lifting and the load of puncturing the systems that have caused harm. Now what it means to be an ally is to wear a bandana or a flag in your hair, or paint your nails a certain color, or send text messages or an emoji or something to say happy whatever. Everything is so corporatized, right? So even corporate entities have the word allies on there. I mean, I remember when I saw social justice on Walmart. I'm like, so everything is shifted. And I'm still hopeful. Because how many people do we have online? And we have people in this room that are saying, whatever it is that's happening wherever, we want to be a part of the shift, whatever it looks like, in however little way I have. And this is how I think about it. I've been using this technology for a very long time. It's like, it's a bag of almonds, big one, like, and so your allies, partners, whoever, you're doing things to change or transform whatever it is that's not working for us. So when you're doing these things, it looks like nothing is happening, looks like nothing is happening. So you'll work with some of the different communities that you're working with. If it's a project that's finished, or it's an event or an activity that's finished, and it looks like, oh, this was great, and you don't know that it's actually made an impact 15 years in the future, but that's an almond, so you actually don't see the work. I don't like change, needle. What's the term? Move the needle, because if you look at the size of a needle, and if that's all we're changing, nothing will ever change. So I like my almond, because you're likely to see more change with your almond, one almond at a time, right?
Well, just to follow up on the question around white savior, because the response and preference it was to ignore it. But in context of systems, when it does play out with whether it's the school system, hospital, criminal, or social service systems, how then do you engage with and tackle those that are coming into neighborhoods or families' environments in that manner and potentially doing more?
It is true. The solution is not to ignore it, so maybe I was a little bit glib in saying just ignore it. So conversationally wise, I don't have those conversations, but when we're talking about truly systems, because I'm guessing this person just sort of like parachuted into the neighborhood and what happened. But that's what we're talking about here tonight, is that how we actually need to have Africentric social work practices, so that people parachuting into our communities would not happen and should not be happening, because people coming in actually need to be applying this Africentric lens to whatever work they're doing. And if somebody is coming in like that, that's definitely in conflict with this whole notion of Africentric practice. That makes sense. Yeah.
No, I think I like the way that you talked about ignoring the part about white savior, because the history that you talked about was how much the social history did not pay attention to what amazing, the pioneers have been worked on for the Black communities and then social work in general, right? So when I'm thinking about that as from the kind of, I'm very interested in the epistemic, way of thinking about it. And one of the epistemic injustice is a contributory injustice. So in a way, there's so much space given for, white, male, or heteronormative social workers, but not that much space was given to Black social workers or the racialized indigenous social workers. In a way, that giving more space and talk about the indigenous way of knowing or Afrocentric way of knowing is way more important than paying attention to white savior. So I like the way that you said ignore it. It kind of works for me in a way to think about giving the space more contributory justice way. So that it was really staying with me. And along with that comment, I'm kind of curious about how you come up with labor acknowledgement. That's the way you started the lecture today. So I'm kind of curious about that, how you start to do it.
Well, again, there are a lot of Black people in the diaspora that have been using it in their private spaces. My family have used, we didn't call it a labor acknowledgement. I think we've borrowed again from indigenous peoples in saying acknowledgement. But what we've done and the people have done is basically thank the ancestors. That's a part of who we are, to always thank the ancestors for what they've done for us, recognize the work that they've done, and promise to not let them down and move forward with the work that they've done. And now what's happened is we've brought it out in public because we're no longer afraid, we're not cautious, we're bolder. Lots of things have shifted. We've pushed the boundaries so that we know that we need to honor our ancestors in public. And so I'm hoping that, this is something that all institutions will have when they have important things. But, Africa wasn't destroyed in a day. So, it'll take time, again, for us to sort of like even think about this, because as Dr. Williams says, we can't seem to do two things at the same time. So how can we do a land acknowledgement and we haven't thought about it that way as yet,
So, okay, I have questions, you have questions, but it has been pointed out to me that we've already gone over time. So, with that, I guess I just have to say, so thank you so much for bringing to us like a topic that clearly we could talk about more. But in respect for the screen that has quit on us, we are going to wrap up the evening. But I just want to thank you so much. And I hope let's think of it as the beginning of conversations. I think you can have these conversations about Afrocentric social work, about all kinds of social work. It is still amazing to me that we haven't had our feminist social work course in this faculty for years. What happened to feminist social work? There's just so many things. So I thank you for stimulating our thoughts today and our questions. Thank all the people who are on the computers for also joining us as well and for sending your questions and staying with us. And I will end the evening there by asking everybody to join me in. Yeah. We did it. Did you want to take one more offline question? Because there was something.
Yeah, sure.
So, Dr. Mullings.